Wall Street got completely bailed out with taxpayer money, and they paid record bonus. I mean, and honestly, I think this is when this whole fourth turning started, and I think this is when the whole political dysfunction started. I mean, we saw it in Occupy Wall Street, we saw it in the Tea Party movement, and we've seen it. It's only grown worse since then. That more and more people have just figured out how rigged this game is in favor of the wealthy, in favor of the bankers. The chart that shows that 1% of the United States population controls, I believe it's 92, it might be 94. It's in the low 90s. And if you look at the bottom half of the population, they basically have flatlined for 30 years. And so this is why people are hurting so bad. And this is what's so terribly unfair. This is not, the American system, I think that the promise of the founding documents, the founding fathers, was the outcomes won't all be even, but the game will be fair. Right? And the game is not fair when you give certain people a big monetary advantage.
Inflation is the surest way to fertilize the rich man's field with the sweat of the poor man's brow.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, this is well over 100 years ago, almost 150 years ago, this guy realized it, right? I mean, it's not, what we're talking about here, this isn't some new revelation by us. It's not like we just figured this out. I mean, our forefathers and ancestors knew all of this. My age anyway, we all remember the stories of the Russians set the price of grain for many, many years. The Politburo used to set the price of grain. And the Russians would have, they'd have too much grain or they'd have famine. And it was all because they couldn't set the price correctly. And so the market does the best job of setting the price in everything. But here we are in the United States in 2025, and we have 12 people at the Federal Reserve Board sitting at a table setting the most important price, which is the price of money. It's kind of like, hang on a second. How can we have a government setting the price of money? It makes no sense. Makes no sense at all.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk'd. I'm here with my good friend, Larry Lepard, and we are going to cover part 2 of our podcast series on his book, The Big Print. Welcome back, Larry.
Nice to be with you. Looking forward to it.
I flew to like 30 hours all the way to be back here with you from Dubai.
I appreciate that.
Just so we could record today. So today I want to talk a little bit about chapters 6, 7, and 10 of your book. Chapter 6, America is Broken. Let's talk a little bit about inflation.
Yeah, sure.
So I've always heard there's been so many different people saying inflation is this, inflation is that. What is your determination on what's the final word here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Milton Friedman actually said it best. Inflation is always a monetary phenomena. I mean, an economy has goods and services, and those grow with productivity enhancement and population growth. And then an economy has money, which represents claims on those goods and services. And inflation is simply when the supply of money increases above and beyond the rate of the supply of goods and services. And so the prices of the goods and services go up. So it's just more money chasing the same amount of goods. That's really my definition of inflation. And Milton Friedman said it best when he said inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. Now, it's a little trickier than that because there's, the different kinds of money. There's the money that's printed, the money that's sent out in direct subsidies. There's fractional reserve money, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's the money out there that drives the inflation. And let's just take a look at the COVID example. The M2 went up 40%. And I think that's roughly about what the grocery prices have gone up in the same time frame. So I consider the money supply to be the best indicator, and growth in the money supply to be the best indicator of inflation. And I should add, since 1971, it's been averaging about between 6, 8, and 7 something % per year. So we've had very consistent inflation since we went off gold standard, although, it varies over periods of years. I mean, there are times when it was higher and lower, but if you average it all out, it's about 7% a year.
I think as Bitcoiners, probably the most insidious part of all this is the distribution of wealth after this has occurred. I mean, I think if you look at data and charts through the first couple hundred years of America's existence, right, like that wealth gap would kind of rise and fall together.
Right.
And I think since 1971, since the full disconnect of the gold standard from sound money, that has just absolutely skyrocketed with the wealthiest top 1%, especially, just blown it out of the water.
It really has. And that's one of the most depressing charts in the book. The chart that shows that 1% of the United States population controls, I believe it's 92, it might be 94. It's in the low 90s % of the wealth. I mean, and if you look at that trend over time since 1990, when it kind of got worse, it's just been straight up. And if you look at the bottom half of the population, the other 50%, they basically have flatlined. For 30 years. And so this is why people are hurting so bad. And this is what's so terribly unfair. This is not, the American system, I think that the promise of the founding documents, the founding fathers was, the outcomes won't all be even, but the game will be fair, right? And the game is not fair when you give certain people a big monetary advantage. And that's what inflation does. Right?
And a lot of people think that it's just, there's a lot of evil built into it, but it's more so just like it's a structural issue of the process,
Right.
is that the wealthy own assets. And when you print this money, the assets go up in value because
Correct.
they're scarce. I mean, it's
Yeah, and some of them aren't bad people. I mean, they're
Yeah.
just sitting there playing the game.
Yeah.
But the system and the people who defend the system, who benefit from the system, they are bad people
Yeah.
because they know what they're doing.
it's a structural issue for sure.
It's a structural issue.
It's by design.
Yeah.
I think it's 92% you have here. What other? So it's not the only thing, right?
No,
you
it's
point
not.
that out here. So
Yeah.
can you talk about like technology and offshoring and some?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, it's so our industrial base has been hollowed out, and that's really created a kind of an apocalypse in the Midwest. And there's some charts at the end of the book that show that there was a time when the Detroit County, had the highest income of any county in the United States. This is back when.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Hard to believe.
Back when the automobile industry was roaring. And of course now, New York and LA, and kind of the coasts have the highest income. But what really happened is when we went to a fiat system, full fiat system, and Triffin's dilemma got worse, the dollar overappreciated and we became uncompetitive in manufacturing. And so this great manufacturing base that we built throughout the whole 20th century and perfected kind of in World War II, where we became the arsenal of the world in terms of saving the world, it went away. And so what you saw, the net effect of that is you had all these people who were used to having decent incomes and decent jobs, and suddenly they were out of work. And the theory was they were going to learn how to code. Well, they didn't. And then all the opioids came around and all the other things. And so another chart I show in the book that's very depressing is what I call deaths of despair, which is to say a lot of people, faced with the loss of their job, the loss of their income, the loss of their middle class lifestyle, they took to drinking or using opioids or other things, or suicide in some cases. And so that you can just see a very clear trend of where that increased, and homelessness, et cetera. So a lot of bad things happen when you take people and you uproot their lives and you give them an economic raw deal. It affects their health, sadly, very sadly, but it's very demonstrable. I mean, you can see it.
You can feel this too. You have a whole section here about the loss of faith in government, the system itself. I mean, if you look at media, it's very similar today with like the trust in mainstream corporate media. Essentially, is at like 14% or
right.
I mean, it's like everybody just knows they're lying.
That's
right?
That's another chart in there that's really depressing. I mean, it's amazing. I think before Kennedy was assassinated, most people trusted this government.
75% or so.
Yeah, most people said, okay, government says it's true, it's true. And I think there was justification for that. We won World War II, and I actually think the post-World War II, presidents were pretty good. I mean, particularly Eisenhower, who was very efficient and built the interstate highway system and so forth. And so, and I don't think, the government was doing some bad things, as we now know as we dig into all the CIA records. But in general, this was an honest, ethical country. But I think that really began to slide when Kennedy got killed. And you can that's when the chart kind of shows the inflection point, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're under 20% right now, and then you have a note here where you put, and that's extremely troubling because 15% of people work for the government.
Right. So they're going to trust it because they're getting a paycheck for it. So the bottom line is nobody trusts the government unless the government writes their paycheck.
It's just classic.
Right? Isn't that perfect?
Yeah. You also said here, polls show that over 80% of voters support term limits, yet the topic is rarely even discussed. In a representative democracy, when 80% of the people want something that is seldom discussed, let alone enacted, the system is broken.
That's right.
I mean, there's like issues today that are like this. It's just like, how?
Yeah, I mean, we're all taught in school, right, that this is a great country and it's a representative democracy and that the will of the people will prevail and truth, justice, and the American way, and all that kind of stuff. And those have become hollow words because if you actually look at the facts, that's just not the case. If 80% of the people want something and we're not even talking about it, well, what do we got here? We've really got a country that's run by the top, and they run it in the way they want to run it.
No doubt about it at all. We touched on the deaths of despair, which has just exploded. Prices inflate because the money supply increases and more monetary units chase the same number of goods. Thought that was a pretty good explanation for people to understand, like just a very solid sentence that kind of breaks it down.
It's just basic, yeah.
Let's talk about this whole idea of this 2% rate of inflation.
Yeah. Right.
I've heard many theories on how they came up with that. What's your take on that?
There was a bill passed in 78 so before the 78 bill, the Fed's mandate was just kind of general financial health. It was very broad, and somehow they got to passing a bill in 78 that said we've got a dual mandate for the Fed. We should strive to have, and I think this is because there was a lot of unemployment, in the 70s. We should strive to have full employment and low inflation. Those are good goals. Price stability, they called it. And then if you look at all the Fed papers since that point in time, somehow, so to me, price stability would be 0% inflation, right? They don't, not deflation, not inflation, just flat. Yeah. But that's not what they got to. And the way they got there, you got to go back and read the Fed notes and the minutes. But what you can see is that over time, officials at the Fed convinced the other officials at the Fed that in general, if we went to zero inflation, we would always be at the risk of a deflationary collapse like the Depression, which of course is not true. But, and that therefore a little bit of inflation to grease the wheels and keep the system running, a little bit of the animal spirits that Keynes spoke about.
2% for the big guys.
Yeah, 2% for the big guys. Exactly. That's kind of what we need. And so that kind of got baked into Fed lore that 2% inflation was tolerable. But you think about that, that still means that the government steals 20% of your money in 10 years.
Yeah. Right? I heard someone say that it was similar to gold because historically gold's had a stock to flow of roughly 2%.
Well, that's right. You could make that argument, or you could make the argument that there was a time when the population was growing at that rate, so maybe there should be some inflation because of population. All fine. But what I would argue, and what we argue and talk about later in the book, is that deflation is really what you want.
Yeah.
And of course, they've tried to kill that whole notion because they're running a debt-based system. They can't have deflation.
Yeah. I think one of the more important things to point out for our listeners here is that, it's not really the 2% per year that gets you. It's more so that, if grandma's putting money away for her grandchildren's education after 20 years, that money's lost 80-60% of its purchasing power, right? So,
well, yeah. And as we're going to come to, they haven't even achieved the 2%.
Yeah. It's way higher.
Right.
No doubt.
And I think we're coming to the chapters where we talk about how they cook the inflation numbers.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, you get,
the numbers aren't real.
The chart of the CPI, which is also, they keep changing it. It's rigged itself.
Right.
Like even the one,
even with
the chart that they give you here, I mean, it's like one of the most striking charts in the book. It's
I agree.
What the fuck happened in 1971, where it's like,
I agree.
Since the War of 1812 and the founding of our republic, I mean, you're just kind of in this CPI rate that's like this, and then all of a sudden, like towards like after Korea and Vietnam War, and then like right at when the gold standard ends, it's like it just fucking goes.
It's a hockey stick.
It's like a Bitcoin chart. I mean, it's just like
it's a hockey stick, and
literally.
What's really amazing to people if you read about it and the history of it all is that there were people who would pay I don't know X amount for a bushel of grain in 1830, and that same bushel of grain would cost the same amount or maybe even less if farmers got more efficient in 1870. I mean, there were periods of decades where prices did not go up.
Yeah.
Which, of course, nobody today even believes or understands that's possible. but it happened. It really happened for most of the 19th century.
Yeah. Another interesting observation is that war periods were inflationary.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about war and inflation and how wars get funded? Because I think that's an important one.
I think it's a very important point. And the chart shows you, and of course the blips are small because of the scale showing the 1971. But here's the bottom line. War is expensive. I mean, war, you're literally not creating anything. You're spending money to try and kill people, and you're wasting resources. And so, and this goes back to, England, France. I mean, this is pre-American history, but, throughout history, sovereigns and countries have had trouble funding wars because they are expensive. And if you go to the people and you say, hey, you know what, well, let's have a war and we're going to take half your income, or we're going to take 3/4 of your income. Well, the people are going to revolt and say, let's not have the war, or, we're not living here anymore. And so what's effectively happened is sovereigns did it with coin clipping and debasement and recoinage. In the U.S., we did it with hidden inflation. So, the War of 1812, I mean, the dollar was convertible into gold. Well, how are we going to pay for the war? We had trouble with that. So they suspended gold convertibility, and more or less depreciated the dollar against gold. And so, that's happened over and over and over again. And when you have a big, expensive war, they rather than tax people to pay for the war, they tax them in a hidden way, which is the inflation way. And the perfect example of that, Matty, is World War I. Most people don't know this. The Fed was founded in 1913. World War I broke out soon thereafter.
I think it was a year after.
Yeah.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, what a coincidence. Well, yeah, there's that. But it was over in Europe, so maybe it was their stuff. But anyway, long story short, that broke out. And of course, the Fed funded that war because what they did was the government was issuing Liberty bonds at 3.5%, and the government was allowing the banks to borrow money from the Fed at 3%. So the banks were making a 50% free spread, and the government was getting the Liberty bonds paid for. But the Liberty bonds were increasing the money supply. Okay. And so the bottom line is what happened is the price index between, 1914 and 1919 or 1819 after the war was over, it went up 100%, literally 100% inflation over 5 years. Yeah. And it caused a lot of social turmoil. I mean, there were riots, there were lynchings. There was a black community out in Oklahoma that was attacked. And it's funny, you had Charles Ponzi did his Ponzi scheme in 2019. The Chicago Black Sox cheated in the World Series in 2019. I mean, there was all kinds of, and then the Spanish flu came through, which really it's kind of spooky how it rhymes with COVID and all that. It was about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But this war was paid for via inflation. And of course, World War II was as well. I mean, they issued bonds again, and they did financial repression after World War II to get the debt to GDP to come down. So yes, wars drive inflation, and they do it. And that's why, one of the hopes of all the Bitcoiners is we think that if there is no inflation, if there can't be inflation because you have a monetary system driven by math, then the government would actually have to come and say, we want to have a war, and here's what you're going to have to pay for it. And everyone would say, hell no. And so we think that there's a great possibility that there would be fewer wars.
That's, personally, my story of why I think Bitcoin is so important is
Me too.
That's the main reason.
I think that is actually one of the most important aspects of Bitcoin. I would agree. Totally.
Did you ever hear I think something came out recently about the war bonds. I think it was the UK where they just basically lied about everything and fixed it all.
Yeah, I did.
And it came out like 100%.
Yeah, it was, Keynes
like that.
Well, I just know the brief outline of it, but I did read probably the same article you read where the British government issued war bonds to pay for the war, and they said they were oversubscribed. And in fact, what they were doing is they were buying their own bonds and using new currency to do it. And so it was just pure inflation. And somehow, this is the amazing part, somehow those records just got buried in some British government office. And more recently, somebody dug into the office and found all the memos and the letters and realized that, holy shit, they completely lied about this for 100 years.
It's crazy because everyone now realizes the government pretty much lies about everything. But before the internet, it was people just trusted it. You just believe
that's
it.
right.
They've just been lying forever about everything. It's
that's
insane.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Here was something you wrote that I thought was kind of just insane to think about. But since the U.S. went off the gold standard, the dollar has lost 98.5% of its purchasing power as measured in gold terms. That's a wild one. That's a wild stat.
Isn't that amazing? It's 70 years. So it's got 2.5% of its value left. And you see this when you go back and you look at, what our ancestors made as salaries. It's, I think my grandfather was making, $3,000 a year back in the 30s, and that was a good income.
That was enough to buy a house.
Yeah, it was enough to live. Yeah.
Wild. This U.S. M2 money supply since 1971, just parabolic. It goes right hand in hand with the CPI and everything else.
Exactly.
But this is the quote that you read earlier. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can only be produced by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money.
Yeah, that's Milton Friedman. Yeah.
So historically, gold has been this hedge against inflation.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, pre-Bitcoin, it was really the only thing we had, and it evolved as the natural form of money. As the Austrians pointed out, and Karl Menger said, money is the good which is the most liquid good that everyone accepts and is willing to accept. And people accept gold as money because of its characteristics. It's durable, it's fungible, it can't be corroded, and it's scarce. Having seashells as money, they tried that. Having beads as money, they tried that. Even having, animals and wheat as money, those are goods you can barter. But money, you really actually want something that should have no other purpose. It shouldn't get consumed. It should just be a fixed amount, or maybe a slowly growing fixed amount. And I think what happened is over time, humankind just naturally devolved. The marketplace just naturally arrived at the conclusion that here's this element geologically controlled that will never, it's not, and then, by the way, there were times when the supply of gold went up a lot. Like when the gold rush happened in California, we had a big burst of gold. When the Spanish went and they raided South America, took all the gold from the silver from the Incas, there was a lot of inflation because silver was money. And suddenly they had all this Incan silver. And so they had more monetary units, right?
Yeah. So inflation will strike even with gold. Have you ever heard the story of Mansa Musa?
No, I haven't.
Oh, this is a fantastic one. I get to tell you this cool story about one of the most famous African kings. His name was Mansa Musa, and they say that he was at his time he was the wealthiest king to almost ever exist. So he had all this gold, and I guess he had converted to Islam. Okay. And I think Paul, can you pull up and see what year Mansa Musa was the king? I think he was the king of I want to say the Songhai Empire, but I could be wrong. It's a great African empire.
Is it pre-Christian or post-Christian? Or?
I think it's post-Christian. So I want to say the 1200s or 800s. Paul can pull it up and find it out with Grok. But this king was so wealthy, he had so much gold that when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he brought thousands of slaves, and they were all just wearing gold. And in every city that he went through, even the poorest people in his convoy, were just decked out in gold. Wow. And every city he went to, he literally threw gold, gave it to everybody, just threw it out to people. People would come to him on the streets. They would see the convoy coming through, and he would just give everybody gold. Oh. So what ended up actually happening was all those places that he went through, he literally hyperinflated their economies with gold. So everything basically came to a standstill. Essentially, the economies almost collapsed because nobody wanted to work anymore. Everybody had all this gold. Everybody felt so rich. Yeah, so what ended up happening was on his way back from his pilgrimage, he ended up having to essentially borrow the gold back from people to get them to go back to work. It really is a wild, elaborate
story. That is a wild story. Yeah.
But it tells you that even if you're using something like a hard money like gold, right? If you inflate the supply, you'll have the similar effects on the economy. Sure. So I just thought it was a little fascinating case study. When you have time. Look it up. Mansa Musa. He was the renowned ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa. Mansa Musa, also known as Musa I of Mali, reigned from approximately 1312 to 1337 CE. So ask him about the story of his gold pilgrimage. Look up, see if it can explain some of that. It's a really cool story. But just wanted to point that out. Let's see what Paul can pull up on this. So he has the most famous for his extravagant pilgrimage to Mecca, which showcased his immense wealth and spread the legend of his gold across the known world. As a devout Muslim, Mansa Musa undertook the pilgrimage to fulfill one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But the journey also served as a display of Mali's power and prosperity. So he traveled with a caravan of tens of thousands of people, reportedly including 60,000 men, soldiers, attendants, and enslaved people, and 12,000 slaves carrying gold and supplies. The entourage included 80 to 100 camels, each laden with 300 pounds of gold. Oh
my God.
Yeah. So let's see here. Route and generosity.
Inflation,
yeah. So go down a little bit. So he went through Timbuktu and Gao, then across the Sahara Desert to Cairo before reaching Mecca and Medina. But Mansa Musa was extraordinarily generous, distributing gold to rulers, scholars, and the poor along the way. In Cairo, he gave away so much gold, reportedly 20,000 ounces, that it caused hyperinflation, devaluing gold in the region for over a decade.
Wow!
Isn't that unbelievable?
An amazing story.
Yeah. So I won't read it all, but it is a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, just the economic impacts that happen on the city. Sure. I was doing some research on it a while ago. It's just fascinating. Oh man. Here I've got, I pulled up the actual inflation statistics from your book.
Ones.
The official ones, right? Because you and I both know that we need to look at stuff like shadow stats to actually get the realistic picture. But the government claims that inflation during these 53 years from 1971 has only been 3.9% per year based on their official statistics. But many statistical experts have debunked the notion that the CPI actually accurately captures inflation. So John Williams and Shadow Stats, I think, just give him a little plug because he has some great.
He's brilliant. Yeah. He's done a lot of work. And what the government did in the 80s was they figured out that inflation was a problem for the entitlements, because the entitlements, Social Security being the biggest one, are CPI indexed. So they thought to themselves, if we can figure out a way to get the CPI index to be smaller, we won't have to spend as much. And so they did. And book outlines the ways they did it, hedonics, and weighting and adjustments and so forth. And
I have a lot of friends that lean to the left, and they harp on that. And I have to tell them, like, hey, go look at the Social Security check, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and see what it would buy you. And like, if you equate the same salary to like what it was today, I think it was something like $7,000, $8,000 a month or something like that. Yeah. And now you get what, 16, like $1,200. There's something really low amount,
right.
But the purchasing power of the initial Social Security was way more. You could
very much.
So it's kind of striking to see that. So it's a way for them to avoid that issue while keeping the populace kind of,
happy.
Yeah. Slowly melt the illusion, right?
Exactly.
So I just thought that was another fascinating way the government kind of lies to the population with the substitution and hedonic adjustments and geometric weighting and owner's equivalent rent. They've got all these schemes and words and fancy stuff. And at the end of the day, your dollar buys 1/3 of the stuff it used to.
Yeah, I mean, the hedonics are great. I mean, there's a Bill Fleckenstein quote in there that talks about how much the price of, I think, a truck went up over a period of time. And, they statistically, they eliminated most of that because they said you got a better truck.
You have anti-lock brakes now, and you got windshield wipers, and
you have things you didn't have before.
It's so classic.
Yeah, so it's actually not more expensive, even though it is.
You're paying, you're getting all this extra stuff. Like you've got a remote button now, and you got the little battery you're putting into it. Right. It's just classic.
Yeah.
So to sum that up, the government changed the calculation of the inflation statistics for obvious political reasons. First, no one likes to hear about high inflation. And second, a large portion of the government's entitlement expenses are indexed to inflation, meaning they grow with higher inflation rates. Thus, politicians have a powerful incentive to lie or cook the books. If you want to understand why the government inflation statistics do not match your real-world experience, here's your reason.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And then you have a couple quotes here that I thought were cool from the von Mises one is my favorite, but we'll read Daniel Webster's. Inflation is the surest way to fertilize the rich man's field with the sweat of the poor man's brow.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, this is well over 100 years ago, almost 150 years ago. This guy realized it, right? I mean, it's not what we're talking about here. This isn't some new, revelation by us. Yeah. It's not like we just figured this out. I mean, our forefathers and ancestors knew all of this. In fact, founding fathers knew it. That's why gold and silver were money in the Constitution.
Yeah, right? it goes back even further.
Well, that's right. It goes well beyond that.
When I did my series with Dominic on his book, Daylight Robbery, I mean, he's got quotes from the Muslim caliphates from the 1200s or whatever. Right. He's got quotes from ancient Sumerians talking on the saying similar things.
This has been a problem for a long time, and it's really just because of nothing more than human nature, right? I mean, human beings will always want to try and figure out a way to cut corners and get ahead.
Here's another one by Webster. We are in danger of being overwhelmed with irredeemable paper, mere paper, representing not gold nor silver. No, sir, representing nothing but broken promises, bad faith, bankrupt corporations, cheated creditors, and a ruined people.
Yep, they understood.
And then my absolute favorite from von Mises. The great inflations of our age are not acts of God. They are man-made, or to say it bluntly, government-made. They are offshoots of doctrines that ascribe to governments the magic power of creating wealth out of nothing and of making people happy by raising the national income.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Did you ever, I think it was Marco Polo had a story. I can't remember where I heard this, but I heard this many years ago. And it was when he went on his, when he visited, I think it was I want to say it was the Khans or Genghis Khan when he went to visit him on his on the Silk Road. And he was so shocked when he came to realize that they were using, the barks of trees, paper
money.
Yeah. I think he literally said, I think in his notes, it was something along the lines of like, this guy is the greatest, the most amazing guy I've ever met. I can't believe it. He's convinced people to use the bark of trees as money. And like, he just was like, he's like, his mind was so blown that he just couldn't believe it. He's
and for a little while, it probably worked. Right?
Yeah. No, it worked for, a while he just kept killing everybody. Right.
Right.
So he was the Khan himself, but he just said, this guy is the most, he's the most powerful man in history. I couldn't believe it that he convinced this.
Pull this off.
Yeah. Cause I guess, when you came to go trade with them, you had to like give them all your gold and they would give you these pieces of paper. And like, it was like, he just couldn't comprehend it.
Right.
And today we can't comprehend anything else. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
let's skip ahead to chapter 10. We'll come back and do 8 and 9 on our very next episode. Pull this up. Classical economics.
Yep.
At its core, classical economics argues that free markets and individual self-interest drive economic prosperity, with minimal government intervention needed. Let's talk a little bit about classical economics, because they don't like to teach you too much about that in school. You learn a little bit, but not too much.
No, they really don't. Most of the schools are pretty Keynesian.
Yeah.
Back in the day, Adam Smith and John Locke and a number of other, philosophers, Ricardo, so forth, conceived of the notion of just economics, basics of economics, supply, demand, and a free market, competitive advantage. Trading makes both sides, better, which is very relevant today when we're talking about these tariffs. And, the classical economic model it was the first time that economics kind of became a science or began to be spoken about as a science. It was a soft science, not mathematical. But, I think the big insight from Adam Smith was that, everybody, by pursuing their own self-interest, if set in an honest way, made everybody else richer. And so, the person who grew the wheat and was paid for his wheat, he got income. But, that wheat went to the baker, and the baker took the wheat and turned it into bread. Mm-hmm. He got paid for his effort to make it bread. And then the person who was able to buy the bread, gave income to the baker. And obviously the person who bought the bread only had money to buy the bread because they had done something of service. Maybe they made shoes that they sold to the baker and the wheat grower. And so, this whole notion of everybody specializes and does what they do best. And we get the more, we get a more productive society as a result of that. And that was, was a powerful notion. I mean, and it had been happening already, but they kind of codified it. They put it in the terms, he wrote this great book, The Wealth of Nations, that explained it and explained how that a free market in these things was the right way to go, that interfering with this only gummed it up and made it worse. And that was really the brilliant insight of classical economics.
So many people that, haven't studied classical economics think that, the economy, everything is just a zero-sum game.
Right.
And I think classical economics really unpacks this idea that, like you said, you get the wheat and then you sell it, but it's not a zero-sum game, because now you've made something new. You've got bread now, right?
Right.
And you have a new thing, right? And then you can make from that bread, you can take it and you can make, a special, frosted cake or something, right? It's or a sandwich, right? And then, it's a fascinating way to think about society and economics.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's this idea of the invisible hand, which is Adam Smith's famous concept. But something that I learned from reading your book that I hadn't really thought about deeply was this idea of capital formation and the idea of the process of saving, why saving is actually important.
Right. That's very important. So these economies operate, and basically one of the things that is really important here is that for human society to advance, we have to get better at doing things. We have to have more productivity as a result. And so in order to have more productivity, sometimes it's just be an invention from the sky, but more often than not, it's because of an investment. And so I used an example of, the fisher person who was maybe using a spear to try and get a fish out of the river and maybe could spear a couple of fish a day. And then if somebody was willing to feed him for the time that he took to build a net and a boat, and he'd go out and he'd grab, 10x the number of fish in the boat that he would get by spearing fish. And so, but somebody had to put up the capital, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody had to feed him in those days when he wasn't fishing, with a spear. And somebody had to have the capital. Somebody had to have chopped down the wood and been willing to pay for the wood to help him build the boat. And there was labor involved and so forth. And so these kinds of developments enhance productivity. And then productivity makes us all better off. Mm. But notice, you only get that productivity increase if somebody saves. Somebody had to have excess food to feed the guy when he was building the net and he wasn't catching his own fish. Somebody had to have the goods, to build the boat, right? It goes back to even reaping and sowing. Another example I used, it's just as simple as eating,
not consuming your seed corn.
Not consuming your seed corn, which was what I was going to say. So you plant a harvest of corn, you pull it all up. You could eat it all that year, but guess what? You'd have no harvest the next year. But in turn, if you save some portion of it, in fact, if you save a large portion of it, you now have more seeds to plant in the following year, and the next year's harvest is larger. So it's that concept that savings leads to investment, which then leads to greater output and greater productivity. And that's really been lost. I mean, our grandparents really understood what savings was all about and how important savings were. It was drilled into us. You don't eat your seed corn. You always keep money for a rainy day. You save and invest if you want to have a better lifestyle. I mean, that's...
But Larry, animal spirits, man, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
I don't think John Maynard Keynes would like what you have to say.
No,
right
he
now.
wouldn't. But those concepts are so far removed from where we are today.
What's crazy is I hadn't even thought about that until I read your book.
Yeah,
it just like
the average person. I mean,
you learn a little bit about the invisible hand, but like that's about it.
No, my grandparents were very much into savings, and savings are incredibly important, and they really. And of course, we've all been taught that they're not important, and the fact you can have what you haven't even earned yet by borrowing. And of course, that's what a Keynesian model will do for you. It puts the cart in front of the horse. It says borrow before you have the money to to produce what you want, and worry about producing it later. And so if basically Keynes, who said we should spend what we don't have in order to live well today, and who cares about tomorrow? And that was where the comment he made that in the long run we're all dead.
Yeah.
Right. That's a very evil comment.
I agree with you completely.
I mean, it's like saying, you're going to eat all your seed corn and your kids are going to starve. Yeah. Because in a few years out, you're not going to have any corn to plant and you're not going to have any food.
If you unpack it to first principles, that's absolutely the conclusion that you arrive at. Right?
Yeah. And so,
that type of thinking.
So if we want to leave a world for our kids that's better than the world we came into, we need to save and increase productivity and leave them with the benefit of those savings. I mean, human progress has taken place as a result of human innovation. I mean, another example I talk about in the book, I just think it's a beautiful one, was, the cotton gin, right? So, cotton's used to make clothing, and the U.S. was a huge producer of cotton. And when Eli Whitney took the time, he's an inventor, took the time to fool around and figure out a way to get all the seeds out of cotton by turning a crank instead of by picking them by hand, productivity went up 10x. I think in one day, a picker could make 5 pounds of cotton by picking the seeds out. But once you put the cotton in the gin, you could get 50 pounds, And so life just got better, right? I mean, as a result of that productivity increase. But Whitney obviously wasn't working on anything else, had the savings to spend the time, had the money to buy the equipment, to test it, et cetera, to bring that innovation to life. And so, again, savings brings increased productivity. That's the important takeaway.
Deferring consumption enables investment in productivity-enhancing capital, whether seeds for next year's harvest, breeding stock for future flocks, or tools that multiply our productive capacity.
Correct. That's the point.
Another quote that you wrote, the goal is efficiency and productivity, not growth. Could you unpack that a little bit and kind of explain what you meant there? Yeah,
sure. So the Keynesian model has been built and taught. They talk about they want GDP growth. They want number go up in everything. That's supposed to be a good thing. Number go up. Bigger economy. And they're even willing to have it number go up, not necessarily in terms of units shipped, not necessarily in terms of units of cars shipped, but just they measure it in dollars. And so if cars are more expensive, they sell the same number. That's considered growth, which it's not. It's the same number of cars. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is that the Keynesian model assumes they're trying to drive animal spirits. They're trying to drive that top line. And that's really not the right metric to be measuring.
Just one part of the story.
It's just one part of the story. Yeah. The right metric is how do we get, in a world of limited resources, the question is, how do we get more with less? And that's productivity. The thing we should be worried about is productivity, because the more productive we get, that's how you support more people with a better lifestyle. If you look at how, our parents live better than their parents and so on and so forth, going backwards, it's all because of productivity enhancing things. Now, with respect to that, there's really only one area where I think that we've really excelled in that, and that is in electronics. We still have enormous, productivity enhancement going on in electronics, and have for some time. We have it in other areas too. But again, if you've got the economy being managed by Keynesians, and Keynesians saying growth, aggregate growth is all that matters, you're actually measuring the wrong thing. And as so many people have talked about, you get what you measure for. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
If you're measuring for growth, guess what? We're going to create growth, even if it costs inflation, right? And that's the problem.
Wow. This is the simple premise behind capitalism. It is why capitalist societies have generated unprecedented wealth and societal well-being for billions of people, outcomes unimaginable by the ancients. Living within one's means and saving for a rainy day are more than just well-worn phrases. They are critical to the economic advancement of society. When savings occur, capital is accumulated. The capital can then either remain sterile or it can be deployed in an effort to earn a return. In classical economic theory, savings precede investment. Think back to the example above. No savings, no productivity growth. So that was something that I hadn't really even thought about until I read your book. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
I learned something really cool there. Another Ludwig von Mises quote. The characteristic mark of an economic history under capitalism is unceasing economic progress, a steady increase in the quantity of capital goods available, and a continuous trend toward an improvement in the general standard of living.
And that really has been true for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet for the first time, sadly, in America today, I think our kids, I know my kids in their 20s are kind of thinking, gosh, I may not be better off. I mean, the American dream was every generation would live better than the prior generation. And I kind of think that's at risk right now.
It really feels that way. I mean, you know, we talked about this, I think, on our last episode or maybe on one of the other podcasts on the Runway Pod. But, my generation particularly, like I mentioned, I was lucky that I bought my house like 5 to 7 years ago. And like just to see the value of that, to see real estate being essentially used as a savings vehicle because fiat money is being printed.
Right.
It's like, it's made it so unaffordable for those of my generation to own a house. And I think we're probably we're probably the first generation where, at this age of like other millennials are probably worse off than their parents, right? Like their parents had houses and assets and all sorts of stuff at this time. Yeah. There was a larger middle class. Yeah. And now it just seems so stratified at this point. So I think you're probably right. Yeah,
it feels like it's at risk to me. I mean, I think we can get back on track.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's at risk.
Capitalist model is allowing the free market to set prices. As we learned in Microeconomics 101, market prices are set at the point where supply is balanced by demand. Prices act as information or signals, telling market participants what to do. I think this is something that's totally missed by the governments of today. Yeah. You really feel it when they try to manipulate all these different things, right? Yeah. And we talked about the price of money itself is the most important price in all of society.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And sadly, very few people realize that. I mean, I think everyone knows that price setting doesn't work and price fixing doesn't work. I mean, everyone, my age anyway, we all remember the stories of the Russians set the price of grain for many, many years. The Politburo used to set the price of grain. And the Russians would have, they'd have too much grain or they'd have famine. And it was all because they couldn't set the price correctly. And so the market does the best job of setting the price in everything. But here we are in the United States in 2025, and we have 12 people at the Federal Reserve Board sitting at a table setting the most important price, which is the price of money. It's kind of like, hang on a second. How can we have a government setting the price of money? Makes no sense. Makes no sense at all.
What's that called?
Price fixing.
What's the price of money over time called?
Oh, the interest rate. I'm sorry. Yeah, obviously. But just to give you a sense of how broken it is.
People don't even understand this really.
I get it. But to give you a sense of how broken it is, I mean, it'd be one thing if they just said, well, we're going to set it at 4% and hold it there and we're going to buy and sell around. No, it's worse than that. At one extreme, it's 20%. That almost bankrupted my dad, right? At another extreme, it's 0%, which is basically like giving money to quintillionaires. So, and by the way, they swing between those two extremes really rapidly. It's kind of like, how the hell are we supposed to manage under these conditions?
I mean, these people have no clue what they're doing. They're just making they're just making stuff up.
They're just making it up as they go along. They do have a clue what they're doing. They're saving the banks and they're keeping themselves in power. Yeah. So they do have a clue. But you're right in terms of the price. I mean, and to be fair, Matty, I mean, God himself couldn't set this thing right. I mean, even if you're the smartest guy in the world, you couldn't set the right interest rate.
It's impossible. Because,
let the market do it.
The market has to, because you're never going to know what all the economic actors in the market.
That's the whole point. Right? Let the market do it. Right?
So here you wrote, for capitalism to work, a free and open market is essential for determining the price of goods and services. This information informs the actions of all economic actors to produce the right amount of what the market wants.
Exactly.
Why shouldn't the price of money be set by supply and demand?
Exactly. It's the supply of savings against the demand for investment projects. And just let both sides, slug it out and negotiate.
I can't remember if you went over this in your book, but I think at some point, I think it was the great financial crisis. Like, they got some of the notes from like the closed door meetings or whatever. And like these people had no fucking clue. They were just like, let's try this. Let's try.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, yeah.
Like, not sure if this is going to work. Did you ever read about that?
I did. Yeah, I read it. Yeah. TARP. I remember Paulson was talking to Kashkari about TARP. And it was kind of like, well, how big should this thing be? And they're like, well, I don't know. $1 trillion sounds really too big, but let's see how close to $1 trillion we can get without freaking people out.
Man.
Oh, maybe 700 billion would work,
Oh my gosh. Here you talk a little bit about savings equals capital.
Yeah.
The choice to save versus consume is always defined by an individual's needs and time preference. Humans live moment to moment, and when resources are scarce and no cost is involved, they always prefer immediate gratification for future gratification. This natural inclination toward immediate satisfaction gave rise to the capitalist theory of interest rates, which rewards individuals who save or postpone consumption. As Bitcoiners, we talk about low time preference, high time preference.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you work for a salary and you earn money, and you can say to yourself, okay, gosh, I want that new car right now. I'm just going to go buy it. In fact, you can even have negative time preference and essentially, I don't even have the money to buy the car. I'm going to take on debt to buy it. But the alternative is you can say, well, I don't really need the car right now. The one I've got is.
Isn't that just how things work, though? I mean, I never heard of just buying a car without having to get to go the other way.
To get financing. I know.
Yeah, that doesn't exist in my generation.
I know it almost doesn't. It's crazy, isn't it? I mean,
it is wild.
I mean, I remember one of my grandfathers would just in general, he paid cash for everything. I mean, when credit cards came out, he didn't trust them. He just was like, if he had to take on debt to do it, he was not going to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, he bought a house in the Depression. He paid cash. I mean, it's just there was no. He just didn't believe in borrowing because he thought it was dangerous, and to a degree it is. But I guess the point is, time preference suggests how patient you can be. This is the Milgram experiment, or the what is it? The marshmallow experiment, right? If you can be patient, you get 2 marshmallows. Well, some people can't be patient. They want immediate gratification, and so they say, okay, give me 2, give me the 1 marshmallow today. I don't want to wait for 3 days to get 2 marshmallows instead. And that's what interest is all about. If you're willing to defer consumption and allow your capital to be used by somebody else, you'll be paid for that, and your capital will grow.
I was cleaning out. I think it was like one of my dad's closets maybe a couple years ago. I was helping him with something, and my grandfather died like 20 years before I was ever born. But in one of the cabinets, the drawers, I opened up a sheet and I saw a sheet of paper, and it was like local dealership here in town, Chevrolet. Yeah. And it was just a receipt from a car he had bought like in the 60s.
How much was it?
I want to say it was $1,200 all cash. He just bought it.
I think that's right.
Like, Dad, what is this? He just bought the car cash. Why was it only $1,200? Like, that was my first question. Like, I didn't really understand.
No, I remember when I was
$1,200. I'm like, how did you just buy this whole thing?
When I was a kid, when I was in the 70s, when I was a kid, the high-end cars, like the Cadillacs, like the nicest car you could buy was like $6,000 or $7,000. It was amazing.
Wild. This is like, it's gotten so ridiculous in places like Japan. I found this out recently, but they're doing like 100-year mortgages on a house.
Are they really? I didn't know that. Like, it doesn't surprise me.
Crazy. It's insane. Like, you're gonna die like 5 times over before you get to even own
basically
the house.
you're just renting the house from the bank.
Yeah. Kind of wild. It's we do 30-year mortgages here, but 100-year mortgages, that's just insane.
Yeah.
Interest rates represent the price of capital. The way in which capital is allocated within a society is the primary driver of productivity growth and economic efficiency or human well-being. The proper way to do this is to let the marketplace decide. Borrowers have needs, savers have capital. Here you talk a little bit about the Soviet Union and how they did their command and control economic.
Yeah, that was the grain thing I used earlier. Yeah.
So the one thing that is really crazy about the whole thing is that it's very hard when interest rates are being changed constantly and there's all sorts of stuff and artificially manipulated. We're kind of feeling that right now a little bit, even with the Trump administration, with how like sporadic the tariff policy is, and will we have any certainty on this? And it's like, causing the market to go a little crazy, and we can't really figure it out. But over long periods of time, how can capitalists and business people properly calculate things?
Well, that's exactly right.
It's all these misaligned, signals to the market. You're interfering in the.
Yeah, when you've got the price of money moving around because of the Fed, and then you've got inflation and inflation shocks coming, it makes it very, very hard for business people to plan. And it creates unfair winners and losers.
Mm-hmm.
People who do the right thing get screwed, and people who do the wrong thing, make a bundle. Upside down.
You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but can you explain what ZIRP is?
Sure. ZIRP is an acronym for Zero Interest Rate Policy. This never, as far as I know, never really, it's not entirely true. I think it briefly existed in the Great Depression for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. But in general, in modern, economies, kind of post-World War II, we never saw ZIRP. We did see 1% interest rates following the bursting of the dot-com bubble. But Ben Bernanke became chairman of the Fed in '82 after he wrote his famous paper about helicopter money. And he made it very, very clear that he was never going to let deflation happen here. And the way he was going to do that was to run the printing press. And when the GFC occurred, the shock was large enough and the fear was large enough that they recognized there was a risk of a Great Depression or of a severe downturn. And so in order to, quote unquote, kindle animal spirits, as Keynes would have said, they took interest rates to literally zero. So they were saying to business people were so afraid to invest, the economy was so damaged, business people didn't want to do anything. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, you got to do something. And here, we will loan you the money. And when I say zero, I mean effectively zero, because I think the cost was like 25 basis points, but that's 1/4%.
1%.
That's as close to zero as you can get, right? Although in the EU, in the EU, they had some negative rates. I know, but that's a different matter. That's a special case. But the long story short is, what they did was they allowed people to borrow money at almost no cost. And then, of course, that borrowed money would be put into a carry trade. They would use that money to go buy something or build something or invest in something that provided a higher yield. And this is, by the way, part of how that large wealth inequality that we spoke earlier happened. And because the people on Wall Street, the people in hedge funds, the people who were very rich, they were creditworthy and they were able to borrow at zero. The thing that didn't occur and that they didn't talk about is that you and I couldn't borrow at zero.
What?
Yeah, right. I mean, I would have liked to have been able to borrow at zero too, but I couldn't.
Wow.
Credit card rates were lower back then. They were probably in the teens, not the 25% that the mob charges us today. Mm-hmm. But any normal person who wanted to borrow that cheaply couldn't. Although I will say it did help bring mortgage rates down, and there were some HELOCs that were fairly low cost during that time frame. And the closest thing that any average American has ever gotten to being able to get good assets at low cost is the last 7 or 8 years post ZIRP, where home equity or mortgage rates were 3%. Yeah. I mean, in an economy that's generally running 7% inflation over long periods of time, being able to borrow at 3% to buy a house, which is a solid asset, that was a good deal. And of course, a lot of us did it. I know I did it. I didn't need to do it, but I thought, well, if they're going to give me 30-year money for 3%, I'm going to do it.
You also wrote here that not only did they get access to cheap capital, but they also get bailed out when their bets don't work.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. I mean, it's 2008, and I talked about this in the opening scene in the book, talks about how I challenged the guys who did 2008. I mean, 2008 was just it was a crime, and it was just a very, very big crime. I mean, these guys ran a credit bubble. They knew they were running a credit bubble. They all got rich off of it. They figured devil take the hindmost. And then when it blew up, they got bailed out. And so what should have happened, and I talk about this in the book, I have the prescription, what I would have done if I had been the government, which is to say, I would have thrown them all out, made them all resign, clawed back their salaries and incomes for the last 5 years, and brought in new people to run those organizations. I mean, I would have saved the.
So you wouldn't have given them the bonuses.
I would not have paid $20 billion in bonuses. I mean, that's the amazing thing.
That's just kick. It's
just unbelievable. Wall Street got completely bailed out with taxpayer money, and they paid record bonus. I mean, this and honestly, I think this is when this whole fourth turning started, and I think this is when the whole political dysfunction started. I mean, we saw it in Occupy Wall Street, we saw it in the Tea Party movement, and we've seen it. It's only grown worse since then. That more and more people have just figured out how rigged this game is in favor of the wealthy, in favor of the bankers, and it's a crime that still has not been accounted for in my view.
And the sad thing about it is, it makes people are like, oh, this is capitalism.
No,
this is not capitalism.
No.
I'll read a quote directly from your book, which is what you wrote: is this perversion of capitalism, the rot in the system, turns capitalism into crony capitalism. Right. It's not a free market. It's rigged by the powerful, Wall Street CEOs, famous investors, and others.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's the unfairness. I mean, we're all supposed to be equal under law. We're not.
So I'll close out this chapter with another one or two of your quotes from your book. People in America, and by extension worldwide, need to understand that inflation stems from the government's habit of printing money to bail out corrupt bankers and corporations. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll be back with episode 3.
Very good.